Thank you for tuning in. Today is part 2 of our 3-part series talking about migrant youth mental health. And we have Bonnie Solis here again today to join us. And Bonnie is actually a member of our Agents of Change team. She does a lot of our content creation, and we are really excited. She brings a wealth of knowledge to us, and she works specifically with this population. So welcome, Bonnie.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm a mental health clinician in South Texas, so I'm excited to share part two, focusing on mental health, working with migrants.
And we will get into our learning objectives here in just a minute, but part 2 is going to really be focused on some of the conversations that Bonnie has, topics that come up, and what are some strategies, say you do have a newcomer, someone that's brand new to the United States, what do you do? What are conversations things that we might not think about, but are really important to make sure that they are really getting the services that are needed to help them be successful as they start this new journey that's probably very jarring for some of them. It's probably very different from the different environments that they are used to. So we will get into that in just a minute. I'm the founder of Agents of Change Social Work Test Prep, and now we are moving into the continuing ed space. And I am currently a DSW student at SUNY Buffalo, focusing on technology, innovation, how we can use tech for good, and then also multicultural supervision and ethics, which I think pairs very nicely with the topic that we're going to talk about today, cultural humility. How do we work with clients that might come from different backgrounds than our own? And then we have Bonnie here. Bonnie is for Agents of Change, Bonnie is our content manager. She earned her bachelor's and master's degrees from University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in 2018 and 2019. She is a mental health clinician in South Texas. She has a very, very, very deep wealth of knowledge on migrant youth. That's specifically the population that she works for. She provides counseling, psychoeducational sessions, and therapeutic groups. And she has been an advocate supervisor at CASA. Bonnie does many, 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 many things. She serves as the marketing chair for NASW Texas. She is very involved in advocating. She has done many things for her local branch. She continues to be an advocate for all things social work. And we are so happy to have her here today to talk about her work. And I think she has very specific skills being in the geographic location that she works in. You're kind of in the hotbed of everything going on right now. So we'll get to hear a little bit more about that. Let's go through our learning objectives for today. After our discussion and our talk today, participants will be able to identify and articulate the concept of grief as it relates to significant life changes for youth. So we're going to discuss that grief does not necessarily need to be associated with death or dying. There's many ways that someone might be experiencing grief. Participants will demonstrate an understanding of how to approach conversations about liberties and rights in the United States when working in migrant youth. We have our own set of policies and the political climate, the social climate that is probably very new to some people. And then lastly, participants will be able to develop skills to use in sessions with clients. So Bonnie's going to talk about some of these conversations that she has, including comparing and contrasting cultural differences between their native countries and mainstream US culture, knowing that culture is nuanced, but there are some mainstream norms that occur here in the United States. And we'll talk about social behaviors, values, legal rights. That might be a conversation to have with the youth that we are working with. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Bonnie. And the first point that we wanted to talk about, it's a big one, but let's talk about grief and processing loss beyond necessarily death. So how does this play out in your work, Bonnie? And what does this look like when youth is coming over? And what are some things they might be grieving?
Yeah, so definitely, as a child, they may not understand all of the emotions that are going on. And of course, we can experience grief in so many different ways. But for migrant youth, they may not be going through a loss of an individual. Therefore, they're having a lot of difficulty understanding the emotions that they're having, which can, of course, be emotional, psychological, physical, things to deal with. In the fact that grief is through change. And of course, they're having a change in their environment, they're having a change in their social networks, they're having a change in all sorts of things, the culture, the religion that they're being exposed to. So, definitely processing those things with them and understanding that what they're going through at this time is grief, but in a different way of it being a major change in their life.
Yeah, I wrote down a few notes here. So give an example of how someone might be processing the loss of losing their home, right? Like they might have been very established in their native country and then they come here. That in itself is a huge loss. But what does that look like for some of the youth that you work with? They come to a new country, they probably have lost their physical home, but we know that home is so much more than that as well.
Yes, definitely. So aside from it being your home, it's what you're used to. So when you come home, the your space, your room, or who you share your room with, at times these individuals may share their rooms with their siblings or with their other family members. And as far as what they have access to, depending on the area that they're coming from, in the United States, we're used to having a shower in our home or several showers in our home, several bedrooms in our home. We are exposed to children who may, bathe in the river or don't understand how to use a sink. So definitely just educating them on that, but understanding the cultural shock of just the environment change that they're experiencing, of these different services or utilities that they have access to, is definitely a big one as well.
And do you see that sometimes they come here and we are very individualized here in westernized culture, right? The expectation is privacy is very big, right? You have your own room, you have your own bathroom, and that is a very United States centric thing, especially as someone who has traveled to many places. That is not the norm in other places. There's multi generations living, people share beds, and that's just what is culturally appropriate. So do you see that as being a big culture shift that just that's not what they're used to?
Yes, definitely. We have big roles on. Of course, these children participate in physical activities, so they have to change for going out and stuff like that. So we definitely have a big rule of if you're going to change, you have to use the restroom, you have to lock the door.
Right.
The big one is like, why? Why do I have to? Why can't I just change like in one big room? Or why can't like
Yeah.
it's fine, it's just my shirt. So definitely exposing them to that because they're used to just changing maybe in one big room with their siblings or other family members or friends, just because that's a norm in that area.
And as a provider trying to be culturally humble, does that take some getting used to not placing judgment on that, right? Because we are very programmed to think, oh, privacy is such a big thing, but being culturally humble, realizing that that is the way that they were raised, that is their everyday. So, was that also an experience for you or for other practitioners where you work that not placing judgment, it's just different?
Yes, and definitely just like educating ourselves on, at one point we may have been like in junior high or high school participating in extra activities and sharing one big locker room, and possibly changing there. So kind of like experiencing that it's very different in like a school setting or a program setting to where we want safety comes first. So educating the kids about that, and educating them about their body and respecting, certain parts of their body and changing and stuff like that is definitely very important, aside from the culture as well.
Yeah, so we talked about the loss of their home, which could be very different. Tell me a little bit more about the loss of culture. And we, of course, would not want them to completely lose their culture, but there is some blurred lines when people move to a new country. So, what is that like, or what are some things that they maybe have to change and adapt to? And what are some things that you hear the youth that you work with saying that they miss or they don't have the opportunities to do culturally?
Yes. So I think as a clinician, it's very important to have a conversation with your clients, aside from educating yourself, but telling the clients, write down what are things that you practice at home. What are things that are very important to you? That may be their values, religion, culture, or traditions, food, things that are important to them, things that um, identify themselves, right? And that list might change with time that they have here in the United States, with things that they like and they grow to want to incorporate, right? But that they have that list of things that they have the freedom and right to continue going back to understand, and being able to connect back to in order to not lose it completely if that's something that they want to connect back to.
I was reading a book and it was about a family that immigrated here, and the biggest problem for them was the grocery stores that they now had access to did not have the traditional ingredients that they would cook with, and that was such a culture shock. Just substituting different ingredients. Do you see a lot of clients that you work with having to adapt to grocery stores are not going to carry some of those traditional native items that they are used to, and having to substitute, or going to a restaurant and it be, for example, a client that had immigrated from Mexico went to a Mexican restaurant and they said, this is not how we cook, right? Just it's very different and the perspective changes a lot.
Yes, definitely. That's a big discussion that we have, and maybe even assisting the client with finding a grocery store that suits them, if that's something that's available, or finding a store that's they can do like online, and have those items shipped to them, if that's something that they have access to. But definitely trying to find like something in substitute of in order to make that dish closest to.
Right.
Um, of course, they do want to feel at home, and acculturating themselves with other people from their culture as well.
Yeah. The last piece I wanted to touch on for grief is the loss of social networks. Tell me a little bit about that. Like maybe you lose your friends, you lose your church connections, you lose your people that you play sports with outside. That's huge because we know that connection is so tied to mental health, and being isolated can lead to a lot of symptoms. So tell me a little bit more about how they might be adjusting or grieving the loss of their social networks.
Yeah, so as children, they have a lot of difficulty understanding the emotions that they're going through and not understanding that even though this person has not physically passed away, that they're processing grief of them by not being physically present with them anymore. The wonderful thing is that, technology is so advanced and we can connect through phone calls, video, and stay connected through social media platforms. But it's as a clinician processing those physical grief, like loss of this individual, and how is it that they're going to deal with this long term, and what are their plans, and also helping them focus on what is your goal, and focusing on the fact that the steps that they're moving forward with, um, aside from the grief and loss that they're dealing with.
I have a question regarding the social networks. They're going to a new school. How many times do you work with clients and they might have, been on a sports team in their native country and then to come, that's a huge loss because we know that we get connections from sports teams or clubs. And how do you help them navigate that?
Definitely just trying to connect with a team, whether it's a language barrier or understanding the new rules in this new sport, because it might be the same sport, but it's very different here in the United
Yeah.
States. So understanding that, and then also a big one for children or teenagers is the comments that they're going to receive. Um,
Mm.
some might be like, "Oh, I got one recently that we processed was you played like a girl, or you run like this, or you play like maybe even from like another country," and them not liking that comment. So definitely allowing them to process those comments and understanding the rules of the new changes of sports or classroom settings that they're dealing with in the network with these new children.
I have seen this play out a lot on the soccer field. Soccer, I don't know if you see this, but soccer is generally the students that I have seen that have come over, it looks very different, right? Or people are not into a soccer football, right? As they are there. So do you see soccer as being a really, or I've seen it go the opposite way, that that's such a bonding point for them. They're like, hey, people want to play soccer, I can get into this. So I'd be curious about how you see soccer play out as a physical activity.
Yeah, it definitely goes both ways depending on the group, especially gender. Like girls can
Yep.
go a completely other way than boys. I see that boys tend to get along pretty well over sports, just maybe here and there of, picking on each other, but also processing and understanding as a clinician, like at what point is it like them being teenagers and then it being cultural. So definitely as a clinician, stepping back and seeing, that processing that as well and being able to process that with your client. And gender is a big thing as well.
Yeah. How, we'll get into this, but I'm curious how when your clients come here, if that's a culture shock to, we have a lot of discussions about gender not being binary here in the United States. Is that a newer concept to some of your clients where they're like, well, where we're from, we don't have these discussions about pronouns, and I'd be very curious to see when I've even talked to people from other places, they're maybe not familiar with those terms.
Yes, definitely. And I think we'll discuss that a little bit more in one of the topics that we're going to cover. But that's definitely something cultural wise, like what is it
Yes,
that they're exposed to at home, and now what are they going to be exposed to here?
right, right. This kind of ties into this. So our next discussion point is, how do you help your clients understand that they might be exposed to more or less rights and freedoms in the United States? Personal expression, identity, I think that very much ties into gender expression and LGBTQ rights and freedoms. How do you see this play out, and what type of psychoeducation work do you have to do for clients?
First and foremost, as a clinician, is understanding where your client is coming
Yeah.
from. So of course, we want to ask them, how they view themselves. And children coming from very different cultural backgrounds that might be very restricted or very strict, whether it's cultural or religion, seeing their responses and what they understand that question, as well as understanding what they're going to be exposed to here in the United States, and the fact that that's a right and a freedom that people have, and respecting that. So definitely just explaining to them the different things that they might be exposed to and respecting that because it's very, very important. And a big thing is explaining it to them as the culture, the language, the traditions that they have every right to continue practicing, as well as this other person. They might be practicing or doing something very different, but they have those same freedoms, and right to practice those things that might be different from them.
Do you see the discussion of pronouns something that's maybe new to them, or is that something that they're used to? I'm just very curious mostly of how those types of discussions play out, because we it's new, I would say it's newer to even people in the United States.
Yes. I've seen it once in the 5 years
Okay.
that I've been focusing on this with this culture or population. And at that time it was something like very discreet because the individual themselves were trying to navigate that as well. And they weren't comfortable trying to find comfort in that as well. Um, and a lot of it is also understanding trends because we have children or males painting their nails for different reasons, right? And that's completely okay, but they see it for different things, whether it's trending or, it being more of like a female thing that they're wanting to practice.
Yeah,
Uh, but I see it as like them, they see it in two different ways of like, oh, it's because it's trending and like this is cool. Such as haircuts. Like sometimes,
yeah.
they might cut their eyebrow here, like do certain things with their hair. And that's completely okay. Just making sure that everybody's respecting one another with the decisions that they're making.
Do they sometimes have to figure out pushing that boundary? They might not have had that opportunity to do that. So is it a lot of like, now I can explore and that's okay?
Yes. And definitely understanding that, that's something that they can explore. It's maybe feelings that have been suppressed in the past because they
Right.
didn't understand, and having that conversation with them and the rights that they do have here in the United States of being able to practice or educate themselves on in order to, you know, feel more comfortable if that's something that they felt before.
My last question on this topic is, do you have to work with parents ever who might think, oh, wow, they're way too open here in the United States, or we're not used to this? Do you have to do some psychoeducation around that?
Yes, definitely. And as clinicians, we want to work with families, maybe in family settings or family sessions, if that's something that your agency allows you to do, educating the family and at the client's discretion of like what they feel comfortable with,
Right.
of course, and opening up that conversation to make sure that they feel comfortable at home and they feel comfortable because as children, they're not able to buy, their clothing, they're not able to buy their things. So having this open discussion with their parents, if that's something possible, so that the child feels more comfortable in expressing themselves.
Perfect. The next thing we were going to touch on is cultural diversity and respect. And we know as clinicians, we think a lot about this, right? But think of we'll talk about youth and teenagers. And a lot of times we know developmentally what is appropriate for someone of this age. And it's very different to approach it from an adult mindset versus a children or a teen's mindset. So tell me a little bit more about what this might look like or what you might talk to your clients about, because they might be coming from a place where there's very little diversity and now they're in a different setting. Also, I'd be curious to know, do they go from being the majority population to now maybe they don't have people that look like them? What is that like? It's a very different setting to have to navigate, and that can be really hard.
Yes, definitely. That's something that we definitely discuss in family sessions and in preparing them for, the church that they're going to be involved in the community or the area that they live in. And having the family members express like what is it that they've been used to that since they've been residing here for some time and how comfortable they feel with these individuals or these communities that they've built. A
Hmm.
lot of the times they do gear or like navigate themselves towards the same culture or religion, and build those relationships with other people of the same religion, values, and practices. So definitely allowing the child to feel comfortable in that same community or venture out as well, and respecting like different cultures and religions and practices that people have. Definitely educating them about that.
Do you find that clients have questions? I often have found that teens are very curious, right? So they might just be asking questions. So do you find that they come from a place of curiosity, mostly because what I have seen is what is new is often, I need to know more about this, right? Like I see that a lot. So I'd be curious how you approach those conversations with your clients.
Yeah, so with children, definitely approaching the conversation as to themselves or like in a group setting, like having that conversation or to myself because I don't want to put someone on the spot if they're in a group setting
Right.
or make them feel uncomfortable in a session. But once you've built that rapport with the client, maybe you can have that conversation of, hey, if I showed up with pink hair or I showed up even wearing a different colored shirt, does that change me as a clinician to you? Or does that change you as a client as far as like your knowledge, your values, your religion, and having that conversation with them?
Yeah. How do you approach this in a group setting? Will this maybe be a topic that you open for discussion? Do you see that sometimes in a group session they might be more willing to ask or venture into those questions? Because I do know that you do run groups or have group discussions about these types of things.
Yes. So definitely just asking them like, when you arrived here, what are some differences that you saw? What are things that you see that are different or things that you have questions about? Um, a lot of it may be geared towards like food that they
Mhm.
mention, or clothing. And we definitely have that conversation of, what is it that's different here and how do you come to understand it? And how do we respect that? Because it's very important, whether someone might be like vegan or
Mhm.
when, practice. I discuss that a lot, as far as food. So would you not have a friend that is vegetarian? It's how are you going to respect that? Because that doesn't change the individual and the things that
Right.
other things that they like, right? But respecting that, and coming like I serve a lot of the population that I serve are coming from Central America. So, meat might be like a very
Yeah.
big thing. So just respecting that if you have like a vegetarian friend, maybe you're not going to invite them to the family barbecue, right? Or you're going to have an option of food for
Yeah.
them or say like, hey, I have these plans with my family, that's very important, but let's go ahead and do this because that doesn't change all the other things that are really great about your relationship, whether you guys get together really well, as far as like classroom setting or sports setting or another club setting that you guys have that you guys get along very well. A decision about food isn't going to make a difference on all these other areas.
Right, and we know that food, whether we like it or not, is such an important piece of culture. And for a lot of people, food really defines the family unit. It's a central point of bringing people together in a lot of cultures, but sometimes here that might not be the case. And I have an example. My family is big on food, Italian, big meals. And my husband's family was not like that, right? So he came the first couple of times he came to family events, he said no, thank you when he was offered food, and that was considered disrespectful in my
Yes.
family, and they could not understand that. I can imagine some of those nuances that you have to work through for your clients can be totally seen as maybe a sign of disrespect, or they're not valuing things that are very important to them as well.
Yes, that's definitely something, that we see a lot. The big thing is food,
Food.
and the difference here. I know just this week in a group setting, we discussed respect, and one of the things that they pointed out was that, oh, you guys throw away the food, like here,
Mm,
we want to pass it out. And it's like, well, yes, we do want to share, but we also want to be very well knowledgeable about germs and allergies.
yeah.
We don't want to pass food down to someone else, and we don't know if they might have an allergy to it. So just being respectful of that as well, aside from what they practice.
Right. And also, a lot of times here, there's different practices, right? We have different standards, even in restaurants, right? I've seen people like, what do you mean you have to take this food away? Or that, those type of things. Those are different standards from a systemic perspective that we have. Or do we compost versus throw things away? Those type of things can be very nuanced, and that can be hard to understand as well.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, let's move into our next point. Accepting differences. So I have here that we have anyone that has worked with kids or teens, what do we hear all the time? That's weird. That person's weird. What they're doing is weird. And I don't know if what would be, I know you're bilingual, what would be the equivalent in Spanish of the word weird?
So it can be used in different terms, but a common one that I use is curioso, would be weird.
Okay.
Eso es curioso, that's weird.
And
Or
do you
maybe
hear that a lot from your clients?
yes. So definitely like just pointing out things that are different. They'll say like, "Oh, that's so weird," or like, "Why are you doing that?" Um, so definitely just explaining it to them to avoid bullying, um,
Right.
from a teenage aspect or like kids aspect, and then having them adjust to like all these differences of it not necessarily being weird, but being very different.
Different. I think that weird has a very negative connotation in English, when weird just could mean different, right? Doesn't necessarily mean bad, but for teens, it can be very, very harmful. It can be used as hurtful. So I'd be curious how the clients that you work with find that weird goes both ways. They might see something as weird, or do you find also the opposite end that maybe they're being called weird, or things that they're doing, behaviors that they're doing are being considered weird?
Yes. So I definitely address this in group settings a lot, just to get like an open, like allowing everyone to share, like, what is this term? What does it mean to you?
Right,
And having that open conversation with them. And then having them give examples of things that they saw weird transitioning to the United States. And then from there, in an individual setting, of course, you can definitely address it if these comments are being made to them, and how it's making them feel. And does that really define who they are? A big thing that I say is, someone might make a comment of you that doesn't make it okay. The
right,
things that they're saying or actions that they're doing towards you is not okay, but does that define who you are? Do they know all the things that you've gone through, all of the emotions and things that you've felt, maybe to get to this point? Or if you're working in a different setting, just explaining to them that this individual doesn't know their previous life and all the
right,
things that they've done. So not allowing these comments of weird or not cool or not fitting in or being different, not allowing them to take that in a personal way because this individual doesn't know them. And even if they do know them, I tell them like, oh, if you have a twin or if you have someone that you've spent a lot of time like in your life, they don't know because you have a very different perspective of your life or those changes. You may have been a different age to process those things very differently. So don't take these terms of being weird personally affect you.
right. And we know at this age though, you want to be anything but weird, right?
Yeah.
What's developmentally appropriate is fitting in and being accepted by others. I wonder, do you do any values work with your clients? So you're talking about what's important to you, what are your values, and how do other people you're choosing to be around have the same values as you? And like that can be universal, right? Kindness, empathy, hard work, those are things that can go across culture. So do you do any work of like what's important to you, and how do you make friends? How do you surround yourself with the people that are more aligned with you than different than you?
Yes, definitely having a list of having them write down their values, having them write down their culture, things that are important to them. And aside from that, like, okay, this positive relationship that you have or a friend, like, how do you define a best friend or a good friend or
Yeah,
someone that you trust? What are the qualities of these individuals? And also seeing like the negative aspect of
yeah,
that. Can you list like if an individual is doing these things, how would that be like a bad relationship or a toxic relationship, a common term used now, in order for them to be able to identify those relationships later on and know, like, okay, this isn't a good relationship for me. And also, I think a big thing for kids is I use the term relationship and they see it as like, oh, but I'm not in a relationship with that person. But it's relationship is a bond or something that you, a connection that you have with a person. You have relationship, a motherly relationship with
right.
a mom or a female individual, or you have a friendship with someone. That's a relationship. So also having them understand the term relationship.
We didn't have this planned, but I definitely am curious. How do you discuss social media? Is that like a trend that goes across, cultural boundaries? And how do you explain, like, I have so many people that say my friend, my friend, my friend, and I said, have you met this person in real life contact? No, it's a friend from social media. So do you have to have some psychoeducation around social media or what this means, or how do you navigate that? Because it's already crazy and difficult to navigate, can be difficult to navigate social media. How do you do that when you're now coming to a new setting?
Yes, so social media is huge. It's touched, I think I touch it on like almost every topic that I
Yep.
do because it can be a safety thing, and it can be something of comparison. We have
Yeah.
to, if you're looking at or working with children or teenagers, comparison is such a big thing. And again, safety is also a big concern with them. So when we're talking about friends on social media, do you actually know this individual? And the
Right.
thing that I educate these kids on is whether you see a bunch of pictures of someone from your school, that doesn't necessarily that mean that the other person on the other side is from your school, because it's very easy to grab pictures from anyone's profile and duplicate it, and make it seem like you are this person. So I definitely educate them on the importance of safety and meeting up with these individuals. And I tell them, I was like, not even talking to them over the phone is going to confirm that this is this
Right.
other individual, because someone can change their voice, like personally change their voice, or use some type of technology in order to sound like this person. So definitely being safe in that aspect. And as far as comparison, having a conversation of what is something that you like to share on social media? What is something that you see that other people like to share on social media? Because a lot of things that we see is positive. Oh, I've
Yeah.
completed this, or oh, we're doing this. It's always something good. Um, Not to say that people need to post negative, that can be very personal. So it's understandable that people don't post those things. But having these teenagers understand that although these people are posting so many great things, that doesn't mean that they're not going through difficult things, and that doesn't mean that they're weird or something's wrong with them, because bad things are happening to them and only good things are happening to this other person. What's shared on social media is not everything and not the whole picture, and is not always safe. So definitely educate
Right.
about
What we see on social media is one piece of someone's life, right? And I have to, oh goodness, I could go on forever and ever on social media use. I'm very fair. I think it's very positive, and I think that we need to also be very mindful of it as well. And I think for teens these days, that is the world that they live in. They're on their social media. So I work with parents a lot, and they're like, I don't want them on it at all. And I said, okay, that's your personal decision, but what might this mean for your child, right? I have some parents that refuse to get their children a smartphone. And I said, that's your choice, but what might this, they live in a world where they might be the only person in the whole grade without it. And what does that mean? And how do we, what conversations and what tools do we need to help your child have to have these discussions? Because what's going to happen? Why don't you have a smartphone? Why don't you have TikTok? So it's just all discussion, and a lot of times teens are, their brains are not fully developed yet, right? So when they see this and this great stuff's going on, what are they going to think? This is the greatest thing ever. So we have to, as clinicians, definitely be mindful of where they are developmentally. And this is with, generally I tell parents when they're like, oh my gosh, they're addicted to their phone, I say, okay, let's have a discussion about what addiction means to the technology and what's developmentally appropriate.
Yes, definitely. And then also being able to assess, because teenagers or even young teens,
Yeah.
preteens, some of these things or decisions are, it's the end of the world.
Oh,
Because they can't have these things, right? So processing that with them and assessing them, because, like, how serious is this? So definitely assessing that as a clinician, how it's affecting them.
yeah. And I have to sometimes very much be very mindful to meet the client where they're at. They'll say, Megan, I don't have a cell phone. And I think, there's many bigger issues in this world. But then I have to step into their shoes. And if they're the only one in the grade that doesn't have a cell phone, yes, that is very hard. And then they say, well, now I feel left out, or I feel like I'm less than, right? So I have to, as a clinician, anyone working with teens, you really have to put yourself in their shoes and think back to when I was a teen. Would this have affected me? Yes, it would have. I would have felt really a certain way if I was the one single person that didn't have X, Y, or Z. Okay. Our last topic, I think, is a good one, consent. You have said you've had to have many, we talked about a little bit with privacy and what does that mean, but we were even talking, I'm so happy that we are now living in times where we talk about consent, but growing up, I'm not sure that I had explicit conversations about consent and personal boundaries. So tell me a little bit, what knowledge do the youth that you work with come in around consent and personal boundaries, and what are some conversations that need to be have around consent? also knowing that developmentally they might be exploring their sexuality, they might be exploring these different type of romantic relationships for the first time in their life.
Yeah, so I think a big cultural thing is understanding age, because in other countries or other areas that's not practiced. Something very common in Central America is that young men have relationships with a lot of older women. So definitely having them understand the laws of the area that they're in, and understanding consent and understanding the reasons behind this for safety reasons, of their body. So also just educating them on that, and as a clinician, understanding the laws of age of consent,
Yeah.
um, for your area as well. That's very important.
And do you have to find that sometimes you have to say here in the United States, this is the legal age that you can engage in a romantic or sexual relationship? And I think sometimes if they're not used to this, there's laws sometimes, and that can be like very jarring that what I could be in trouble for this when in my country that I come from, this is actually not out of the norm at all. So do you have to kind of talk about what the consequences could be if there are violations? Because that's probably a huge change as well.
Yes, definitely educating them about the laws of in their area or the rules and consequences of it, not only as a youth, for them to understand and feel empowered if for any reason that's not respected at some point, understanding what is it that they can do. Um,
Yeah,
Aside from that, once they do become an adult, understanding that they wouldn't be able to have a relationship with someone, 17 or younger, depending on the area that you're at, what age is being defined, and respecting that, because there is consequences that can be very serious as well.
how do you teach personal boundaries and that you can, like you said, you are the agent of your own body? That's for some people, that's a very new concept, right? That if you're feeling uncomfortable, you can say no, and this is how you appropriately do it. Because I have worked with so many clients that say, I feel like it's going to create conflict or I don't feel comfortable. That's a very hard situation to navigate. So what kind of conversations do you have around that as well?
Yeah, so definitely privacy is a big one. As we mentioned, like changing, utilizing the restroom, and it being a private space, something normally practiced here in the United States. Not necessarily imposing like their decisions or their
Right.
personality, but letting them know, there's certain areas that we have to respect, of, private areas that we have to respect. So definitely having those conversations and educating them about that, and being able to pinpoint it depending on their age,
Yeah.
educating them on that in very different ways, whether you're having to do, like maybe you have an outline of it and then you go ahead and color it in of something that not only private areas, but stuff that they feel comfortable with. And understanding that this boundary or bubble, I like to explain
Yeah.
it as, can be very different with relationships that they have. Their mom, their parents, their family
Right.
members can be a very close bubble, and friends or teachers and counselors, of course, would be a very different, bubble that you have. And not necessarily family members or friends having to be a close bubble. If you're feeling uncomfortable with these individuals, that's okay. Understanding what your values are, understanding what your religion is, and making sure that these individuals respect it. Um, a big thing for teenagers is helping them understand that a family member or person that you're in a relationship with does not necessarily mean that you have to do these things.
Right.
Culture goes a big way in like, oh, I have to respect my elders, or I have to respect this person that's older than me, right?
To the
So
point that it could be unsafe in some
yeah,
situations. Yeah.
definitely educating them about that. If they're crossing these boundaries and these values that we've
Right.
discussed, or you feel uncomfortable, you feel that ugly feeling in your stomach, your body's telling you something, and it's very important for you to speak up to someone that you do trust.
The last question I have around this, it's kind of twofold. How do you teach or how do you explain to clients that you are a mandated reporter? That's not something that at all is across different countries. So how do you explain mandated reporting? And then to parents, how do you explain that I'm a mandated reporter and this is what that means?
Yeah, so definitely just letting them know that the current space that they're in is private and
Right.
be shared, right? But to an extent of my job is your safety and your comfort. And if for some reason, that's broken, I will, seek support for you. I will seek, those other outlets for you in order for us to, continue working. It's more of like um being an advocate for these
Yeah.
clients, so explaining to them, that you're here for their safety, and they might not know those steps, but hopefully, if you build rapport and this is something that has occurred to them, that they can eventually, make that outcry to you if it's something that's needed. And then as far as like
You
for
Go
parents,
ahead.
yeah, for parents is the same of more of like, oh, I just want to make sure, your child is safe. And if for
Yeah.
some reason something is reported, or has to be reported, we can go ahead and have that discussion and explained.
The last thing I was gonna ask around this is, do you find with some of the clients that you have, parents, teens, that this is kind of a taboo area that maybe's never been talked about, right? Like, we don't talk about our bodies. That's absolutely inappropriate to talk with someone that's outside our family unit. Or we don't talk to any individuals at school about this type of stuff. What happens in the home stays in the home. Do you see any of that type of dynamic that you have to also reach a little bit with clients?
Yes, definitely. So even in just a regular assessment, of course, we want
Yeah,
to know what their sexual identity is and how they identify, and if they're comfortable having this discussion or being asked this question. And a lot of them say no.
right,
Um, and I let them know, at this point, I'm just trying to get information, basic information, kind of like a medical exam, right? Just a
right.
background. So I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable. I just wanted to get the information in regards to that. And that way I can focus on things and help that you need. So definitely explaining it to them in that way, but helping them understand like these different terms or consent, like in a whole other way of like, I understand that it's not something that you may have practiced there, but we want to respect ourselves and our body, not only as children, but as adults as well. You have
Yeah.
every right to report these things if it's needed.
Yeah, I have to have these conversations too. That's weird. Why are you asking me that? So with teens, something I do, I'll be curious if you have any strategies. What I do in the first couple sessions is I'm gonna list all of these things and you tell me like how comfortable you feel bringing this up. Like, would you feel comfortable with me asking you about like a romantic relationship? And some are like, yeah, no problem. Others are like, no, I'm not going to talk to you about that. So just kind of getting a feel, that's a clinical skill, right? To assess where are they where's their comfort level with these things. And um I have some kids that are like, well, plug their ears. They're like, no, I do not. Or like, I don't ask you these type of questions. And I'm like, that's fair, right? Do you have any that so my strategy is to kind of say what's your comfort level with this, and please tell me if this gets to a level where you don't want to talk about it, but do you have any tips or tricks for when you get these kind of uncomfortable or taboo topics with clients?
Yeah, so on my end, a lot of it is education, because a lot of these children feel that they're like required to ask these questions.
Oh, yeah.
Just recently, I had a child say, "Oh, I lied about everything because I thought you were someone else," even though I had explained it to them.
Right.
I understand they're in shock and they're not grasping all the information or understand everything. But kind of letting them know that, hey, I'm about to ask very personal
Yeah.
questions, but at any point in time that you feel uncomfortable or that this is a lot of like the assessment questions, because then from
Yeah.
there I kind of grasp what they need. But letting them know at any point in time you feel uncomfortable, please let me know. If for some reason you don't understand because of a language barrier we might be having, definitely let me know as well. And something very important is don't give me an answer that's not true, um,
Right.
if you don't feel comfortable talking about this. Just let me know and I'm okay. I'm not gonna force you to share anything that you're not comfortable with. We can move on, we can move forward. I'm not here if you don't provide a response, that's completely okay. Or if you don't remember, we have to understand as clinicians that they're children, so they may not completely understand the story. So it may not be the same story that you get from a parent, because they're not going to understand to an adult level. And another thing is they might be in shock depending
Yeah.
on why they're here, at your program.
Trauma responses, we know that's a big thing.
Yes, so making sure that they completely understand and being patient with them because they're children and they're also going through something at the moment that we're providing these services.
Absolutely. Well, I think we covered many, many important things. For part two, there's a part three, so we're not done yet. We're gonna have more and more we probably could have 5 parts to this, but part three will be a tune in. If you're looking for some key resources, we have some research articles here that people can check out to talk about migrant youth newcomers, how can health professionals and clinicians understand better the needs of these clients. And I think that we had such a good narrative and perspective from Bonnie, who does this day in and day out. So, of course, we want to wrap things today for part two by thanking you, Bonnie, and I look forward to our conversations in part three.
Thank you all so much. We look forward to seeing you all for part 3.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.